In the heart of British Columbia, about 80 kilometers outside of Revelstoke, two loggers, Dan and Mike, were working a stretch of forest just west of the Columbia River. It was early October, and the air had started to take on a sharp bite. The two had been working together for the better part of a decade, logging remote areas like this one. Their job was tough, the days long, but the work had its rewards. You didn't mind the hard labor when you were surrounded by views like these: snow-capped peaks, dense forests, and rivers that cut through the land. The area they were working in was rugged, even by their standards. The trees here were old, towering over the landscape. The underbrush was dense, making every step feel deliberate. They'd been dropped off by a helicopter 2 days prior, setting up a small camp about a kilometer from where they were actively working. Logging in these remote parts required them to stay out for a week at a time, cutting trees, stripping them of branches, and marking the logs for transport, which would happen once a crew arrived with the necessary equipment. It was around noon, and the two men were taking a break. They sat on a couple of felled logs, eating sandwiches they'd packed earlier that morning. There wasn't much conversation between them. It wasn't that kind of friendship. They'd been working together so long that silence was comfortable, and when they did talk, it was often about the work or what was going on back home. The forest around them was quiet, aside from the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only get when you're miles from civilization. After lunch, they got back to work. Dan was operating the chainsaw, and Mike was marking trees. They moved in a steady rhythm, a well-practiced routine that had them working efficiently, despite the isolation. The hours passed, and soon enough, the light started to shift as the sun dipped lower in the sky. This far north, daylight hours were already starting to shorten, and they knew they'd need to pack it in soon. It was Mike who noticed something first. He was standing a little way off from Dan, his axe resting on his shoulder as he surveyed the area. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but it was as if the woods had gone completely still, even more so than usual. He looked around, scanning the tree line, his eyes narrowing. It was then that he noticed a large shape just beyond the trees, about 50 meters away. At first, he thought it might be a moose. They were common enough in these parts, and a bull moose could look pretty imposing. But as he squinted, trying to get a better look, he realized it was standing upright. "Dan," Mike called out, his voice low but urgent. Dan cut the chainsaw and looked over, following Mike's gaze. He saw it too. Whatever it was big, easily over 7 feet tall and broad, its silhouette dark against the trees. They both stood there staring, not quite believing what they were seeing. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching them. "What the hell is that?" Dan muttered under his breath. He stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to his belt, where a hunting knife was sheathed. He didn't pull it out, but the action spoke to his unease. For a moment, the figure remained motionless. Then, slowly, it turned and walked deeper into the forest. Mike and Dan stood there for another beat, unsure of what to do. "We should follow it," Mike finally said, his voice hesitant but curious. Dan hesitated, his brow furrowing. "And do what? We don't even know what we're dealing with." "Could be some guy," Mike suggested, though even as he said it, he didn't believe it. There was something about the way it moved, the sheer size of it, that didn't seem human. Reluctantly, Dan agreed, and the two of them set off in the direction the figure had gone. They walked cautiously, keeping their distance from where they thought it might be. The underbrush was thick, making it hard to move quietly, but they did their best. Every few steps, one of them would pause, listening for any sign that the thing was nearby. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to grow even larger, and the light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer. After about 15 minutes of walking, they reached a small clearing. The ground was soft with moss, and in the middle of the clearing, they saw something that made their stomachs drop. The soft earth was marked with a series of large, deep footprints, far too big to belong to any man. Each print was at least 18 inches long and wide, with distinct toes pressed into the ground. "Jesus," Dan whispered. kneeling down to get a closer look. "You ever seen anything like this?" Mike shook his head, feeling a strange mix of fear and awe. The prints led off into the trees on the other side of the clearing, but they didn't follow. Something about those tracks felt too real, too ominous. They'd heard stories over the years. Everyone who worked in the woods had. Tales of strange creatures lurking in the forests, things that couldn't be explained. But they'd always written them off as campfire stories, nothing more. Now, though, standing there with those massive prints in front of them, they weren't so sure. "Maybe we should head back," Mike suggested after a long pause. Dan nodded slowly, his usual bravado tempered by the reality of what they were seeing. They turned and started making their way back to their camp, keeping a steady pace but not rushing. Neither of them said much, the silence between them now heavy with unspoken thoughts. By the time they reached camp, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. They lit a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat around it, each man lost in his own thoughts. That night, neither of them slept well. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual. At one point, in the dead of night, they heard a low, distant howl, something neither of them had ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't a bear. They didn't speak of it in the morning, but both knew what they had heard. The rest of the week passed without incident, but the memory of that day lingered. When they finally got picked up and returned to civilization, they didn't tell anyone about what they'd seen. It was one of those things that was hard to explain, and they weren't sure anyone would believe them anyway. But they knew what they'd seen, and it had changed the way they looked at the forest. It wasn't just a place of work anymore. It was a place where something unknown, something unexplainable, still roamed. So, this happened back in early November. You know that time when the cold starts creeping in, and the leaves are pretty much all gone. I was driving home from a weekend trip, taking the back roads through northern Michigan. I live in Cadillac, so it's not a super long drive, but I like taking the scenic route. It was getting dark, and the road was almost empty, just me and the occasional car going the other way. I've always loved this part of Michigan. Grew up near these woods, spent summers camping and hiking around here. I guess it's one of those things that sticks with you, even when you're older. I still try to get out in the woods when I can. But this particular night, I was just ready to get home, feeling that tired but happy thing after a weekend away. The road was quiet, just the sound of the tires humming along the asphalt. It was about 7 p.m., already pretty dark out, but there was still a little glow left in the sky. The stretch of highway I was on has always been kind of eerie at night. There aren't many houses out there, mostly just miles of dense woods on both sides. I've driven this road plenty of times, so I wasn't really thinking about it. But something weird caught my eye as I came around a bend. Up ahead on the side of the road, I saw a figure. It was hard to make out at first, just this tall, dark shape. My first thought was, oh, must be a deer, which is common around here. But as I got closer, I realized this thing wasn't a deer. It was standing on 2 legs. That definitely made me slow down. At first, I thought maybe it was a person, maybe some hunter or someone who got stuck out late. But something about it felt off. It was too big to be a person, and the shape wasn't right. As my headlights lit it up, I felt my stomach drop. This thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in dark, scruffy fur. It looked like it had the body of a man but hunched over a bit, with long, thick arms hanging down. The head, though, that's what really freaked me out. It looked like a wolf's head, pointed ears, long snout, and these glowing yellow eyes that reflected the light from my headlights. Its mouth was open just enough for me to see these sharp teeth glistening. I didn't know what to do. My foot hovered over the brake, but I wasn't sure if I should stop or just hit the gas and get out of there. The thing just stood there, right on the edge of the road, watching me. Time felt like it slowed down as I kept getting closer, inching past it. My heart was pounding, and my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. For a split second, I thought about grabbing my phone to snap a picture, but my instincts kicked in. and I didn't dare take my hands off the wheel. I was close enough to see every detail of this thing. Its fur was thick and dark, almost black, but there were patches of brown near its chest and legs. Its eyes, those creepy glowing eyes, followed me as I passed by. Just when I thought I was in the clear, it moved. In one smooth, almost graceful motion, it stepped onto the road. I swear it moved faster than anything that size should. It crossed behind my car, disappearing for a second, and that's when the real panic set in. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car roaring as I tried to speed away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. It was running after me, on two legs, sprinting actually. Its arms pumped like a person running, but its movement was more like an animal, fast and terrifying. It shouldn't have been able to move that quickly, but it was. For a few horrible seconds, it kept pace with my car. I could see it in the mirror, those glowing eyes locked onto me. The weight of fear was heavy in the pit of my stomach. I pressed the gas harder, the speedometer climbing higher, but it stayed right behind me, like it was toying with me or something. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it veered off into the trees and vanished. I didn't stop, didn't even think about it. I just kept driving as fast as I could, my eyes flicking from the road to the rearview mirror, expecting it to come back at any second. My mind was racing. Did that really just happen? Was I seeing things? Maybe the long drive and the empty road were messing with my head. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the memory of that thing, its eyes, the way it moved. It was too real to be a hallucination. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in and just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, my heart still pounding. The woods around the lot looked darker than they should have, like the whole world felt off. I got out of the car, legs feeling wobbly, and walked inside. The guy behind the counter didn't even look up when I came in, which was fine with me. I just needed to be around people for a second, to ground myself back in reality. I grabbed a cup of coffee, hands still trembling as I poured it. While I was standing there, I overheard a couple of older guys talking in the corner. They were wearing flannel jackets and looked like they'd been out in the woods. One of them was telling a story about finding strange tracks a few weeks ago. Tracks too big to be from any bear or wolf. That got my attention. I walked over, coffee in hand, and asked them if they'd ever seen anything weird around here. Tried to keep it casual, but I'm sure my voice was shaky. The guy gave me a look, then slowly nodded. "Depends on what you mean by weird," he said. I hesitated, then told them about the creature I saw. "Something like a big wolf, but on two legs?" I said, trying to keep it together. The men exchanged glances. One of them shrugged and said, "You're not the first to ask. There's a lot of stories out here. People see things they can't explain, but we don't talk about it much." That hit me hard. I wasn't alone in what I saw. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some story or my imagination. And the rest of the way home, every shadow in the trees made me feel like it was out there, watching, waiting. Do any of you know what that thing was? I'd really love to know. In the heat of late summer, just outside of Okeechobee, Florida, two sheriff's deputies, Officer Scott Harbaugh and Officer Luis Gonzalez, were out on routine patrol. This part of Florida, with its endless swamps and flatlands, had always felt a little eerie to Harbaugh. He'd grown up near the Gulf Coast, more accustomed to beaches than the dense, dark marshlands that surrounded Lake Okeechobee. The roads they patrolled were narrow, winding through thick groves of trees, past the occasional cattle ranch, and long stretches of swamp that seemed to go on forever. The air was so still that night that it almost felt like the whole world had gone to sleep. They just pulled off the main road, driving slowly down one of the many dirt paths that cut through the wetlands, when the radio crackled to life. Dispatch reported something strange, a 911 call from a resident a few miles away, claiming to have seen a large reptile-like creature on his property. The caller had sounded shaken, but that wasn't uncommon. People saw all kinds of things out here, large alligators, the occasional snake, sometimes even a panther if they were unlucky. Officer Harbaugh glanced over at Gonzalez, who raised an eyebrow. "You think it's another gator call?" Gonzalez asked, his voice light, but with a trace of tiredness. It wasn't unusual for people to panic over the wildlife in these parts, especially at night when shadows could play tricks on the eyes. Harbaugh shrugged. "Could be. Might as well check it out. Could be a big one this time." They turned the car around, heading down toward the caller's location. As they drove, Harbaugh couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He'd dealt with his fair share of strange calls over the years, but something about the way dispatch described this one felt off. The caller hadn't just described an alligator. He'd been adamant that this thing was walking on two legs, something large and reptilian, standing like a man but not a man. The drive took them deeper into the swampy terrain. The road turned from dirt to a mix of packed mud and gravel, surrounded by thick vegetation that seemed to close in around them. After about 10 minutes, they reached the property, a small, rundown house set back off the road, surrounded by overgrown brush. The lights from the cruiser cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the yard, but there was no sign of the resident. Harbaugh stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He scanned the area, listening for any sounds beyond the steady drone of insects. Nothing. Gonzalez followed suit, his hand resting on the grip of his flashlight as they approached the house. Before they could knock, the door creaked open, and a man in his 60s stepped out onto the porch. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You the officers?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah, we got your call," Harbaugh replied, his tone calm. "You said you saw something?" The man nodded quickly, his hands trembling. "It's still out there. I swear I ain't crazy, but I saw it. Big thing, bigger than a gator, and it wasn't walking like no animal I've ever seen." Harbaugh exchanged a glance with Gonzalez. "Where exactly did you see it?" he asked, his hand moving toward his belt where his flashlight hung. The man pointed toward the back of his property, where the thick brush met the edge of the swamp. "Over there near the trees. I saw it standing in the shadows. It was watching me, just standing there, like it was thinking about coming closer." Harbaugh nodded, keeping his voice steady. "We'll take a look. Stay inside, lock your doors, and we'll let you know what we find." As the man retreated back into his house, Harbaugh and Gonzalez headed toward the tree line. The beams from their flashlights cut through the dense underbrush, but the darkness swallowed up most of the light, leaving everything beyond just a mass of shifting shadows. The air was thick, the smell of the swamp strong as they moved deeper into the property. "I'm telling you, it's going to be a gator," Gonzalez said quietly, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "People out here don't know the difference sometimes." Harbaugh didn't respond right away. He kept scanning the area, his senses on high alert. The feeling in his gut told him this wasn't going to be just another gator call. Something about the man's fear had felt too real, too raw, like he had seen something that truly shook him. They reached the edge of the swamp, the soft ground squelching under their boots. The trees here were tall and thin, their branches hanging low, draped with Spanish moss that moved slightly in the breeze. Harbaugh's flashlight passed over the trees, and that's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Just beyond the trees, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, easily 7 or 8 feet. Its skin was dark and scaly, glistening faintly in the flashlight's beam, and it was standing on 2 legs, its body hunched slightly, with long arms hanging down, claws glinting at the tips. But the head, that's what made Harbaugh's breath catch in his throat. The head was reptilian, with a long snout, sharp teeth visible even from this distance, and eyes that seemed to glow a faint yellow in the darkness. "Luis," Harbaugh whispered, his voice tight. "You see that?" Gonzalez turned his flashlight in the same direction, and the beam landed square on the creature. For a moment, neither of them moved. The creature was completely still. Harbaugh felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "Is that—" Gonzalez started, his voice barely a whisper, but before he could finish, the creature moved. In one swift motion, it turned and darted deeper into the swamp. It didn't run like a man or even an animal. It was something in between. Jesus, Gonzalez breathed, taking a step back. What the hell was that? Harbaugh shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know, but it's not a gator. For a moment, they stood there, the sounds of the swamp slowly returning around them as the creature disappeared into the distance. Harbaugh's heart was still pounding, and his hand was gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles were white. Should we call it in? Gonzalez asked, his voice still shaky. Let's check the area and make sure it's gone first, Harbaugh finally said, his voice steadying. We'll report what we have to. They spent another half-hour combing the edge of the swamp, but there was no sign of the creature. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove it had been there. By the time they returned to the cruiser, the night felt even darker than before. As they drove back toward the station, the radio silent between them, Harbaugh kept thinking they would see it again. After all, the swamps of Florida are vast and unforgiving, full of mysteries that most people would never see or even understand if they did. But that night, for a few brief moments, Harbaugh had glimpsed something that still haunts him. Do any of you have insight or suggestions that can help?